Hey guys, what is up? Swim here, and this is a quick deck guide for Kinkou Elusives. This is the version of Kinkou Elusives that I would personally recommend. This is my version. This is based off of Manu S's version, which is based off of some guy in ladder named Agent Alexi, and effectively the idea is really straightforward. In fact, you've probably seen this kind of deck on ladder as well. This is like a fairly common archetype. It's a tier 1 deck right now, and the idea is we're just running elusives. We're using Kinkou Wayfinder to be able to pull cards from our deck, namely Omen Hawk and Navori Blade Scout. Now that Mentor is gone, the way of the dodo, Conspirator needs a new, target to attach itself to, and it does so in the form of Omen Hawk. Elixir of Iron is also great at keeping your valuable elusives alive, and you're just going to swarm the board and basically just tap out a ton of damage without letting them block anything, because of course elusives end up being unblockable. You've got really good allegiance odds here with only 7 Freljord cards, and I mean, need I say more? This is a really straightforward deck. At the end of the day, you're just spamming elusives out. Now, the reason I'm recommending this deck right now is because this is probably the #1 deck that I would recommend climbing with right now if I had to pick. Now, there's a few criteria that goes into this, because a lot of people ask, Swim, what's the best deck right now? And best is kind of like a very relative term. It depends like what your goals are, right? If you are looking to climb right now, if you're looking to climb to Masters, if you're looking to climb to Diamond, whatever, this deck will probably take you places the fastest. That's what I'm recommending it as. It's going to have... So, first of all, it boasts an extremely high win rate. Out of all the Masters games, according to the Mobilytics tracks data, which, I talked about in my last Meta Mondays video, this has one of the highest stable win rates. In fact, I would say the highest stable win rate at 62% across all Masters games, which is pretty great, and that's going to be stable. That means that there's not really a lot of like meta response that will come in the way of that win rate, which is really, really, really important, because there's a lot of decks that achieve high win rates, but only for very fleeting periods of time. This is a meta stable deck, and that's why it is a tier 1 deck. Okay, so you're going to basically just generate a ton of value off of elusives, kill the opponent very quick before they can do anything else. Super straightforward. I can't explain it more than that, because that's just kind of all the deck is doing. And my version personally runs this one of Battle Fury as a way to close out the finisher for a game. I'm a really big fan of this card as a one of in these decks. Alright, so now that we've talked about this deck, why you should play it, I'm going to go ahead and jump into 2 real quick games, and we're going to basically break down how the deck plays out. Let's... Take it away, Other Swim. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get into a game here. And here we're against Heimer Karma. This is a, pretty standard list. You're going to see this a fair amount as a control list. It was a lot more popular like around a week ago, and it's been falling off just a little bit. Okay, so for the opening hand, this is a matchup where Deny is fairly valuable, but not valuable enough to be keeping early. He's not running like any big super expensive spells. None of the Shadow Balls cards like Harrowing that, I might want to keep Deny for. There's a lot of spells we can deny, like Static Shock, but with an opening hand like this, we're not necessarily going to want that. If we're into like Green Glade Duo, you can protect your cards from Static Shock with like Elixir of Iron instead, which ends up just being cheaper and more reliable. So I think I'll take a mulligan like this. Basically, Blade Scout, just as an effective pressure tool early on, is going to be quite important. Another thing about keeping Elixir of Iron over Deny is it plays for the allegiance odds as well, right? Like, part of what makes the Kinkou Wayfinder so good in this deck is because the Omen Hawk and the Elixir of Iron tends to be things you want to keep in your opening hands, right? Of course, the one Battle Fury doesn't fall out of the rule, but it's just the one of. So we have a very, very spell-heavy opening hand here. Hit the Zed on our turn 3 attack, which is pretty nice. Blade Scout's going to do a pretty nice job of like blocking out the Pickpocket from being able to see too much value here, which is pretty great. And our Zed comes down with 2 bank spell mana for the Elixir of Iron, which is fantastic. I think it's a good time to be developing the Zed. I don't think there's anything crazy going on here. It's going to be a little bit more value to play the Zed than, for example, the Shadow Assassin. So at this point in time, we got to be worried about the opponent's plays. It's very likely that they're on cards like Mystic Shot. It's very likely that they're on cards like, Static Shock, maybe get excited. There's a Will, and honestly, I'm pretty okay with that, all things considered. It's 4 mana, you know, that's a very expensive use of 4 mana. It's going to be the one thing that does get rid of the Zed in a permanent way, right? Whereas, you know, when you compare it to, like, Mystic Shot, it would have just traded for Elixir of Iron. I guess permanent's not the right word, because this is just going to come back next turn, but you know what I mean. It actually is able to stop it from attacking that turn through Elixir of Iron, which is pretty big. So there's a few things I can do now. We could, in theory, play the Kinkou if we wanted to. It has a bit of a dangerous tendency here in potentially enabling some specific tools. I think it's going to be a little bit better to take the Omen Hawk here. We don't really need anything crazy. Like, the thing about Kinkouing here is that you're enabling a lot of tools like Static Shock is probably the easiest example of that, and you do prefer getting the Omen Hawks down earlier, because obviously just getting their buffs drawn into your hand earlier is nice. There's a Mystic Shot, pretty expected. That's going to trade with an Elixir of Iron. And this is the power of Elixir of Iron. Because this deck only loses to things that are removing its cards, you just generate nuts trades. Like, look at that. It's such a simple trade. It's going to happen so commonly. We're up 1 mana. We traded our 1 mana for his 2 mana. That's crazy. For how often that trade happens, that is crazy powerful and crazy reliable. Alright, let's go ahead and drop our Wayfinder here. And of course, you know, if we hit, we're going to hit an Omen Hawk and maybe either a second Hawk or a Blade Scout, right? And this is how this deck is going to play out, right? You're just going to be putting a ton of pressure out on the opponent. Now, he's at 7 mana. Usually, these are the turns where, you know, if the pressure is alleviated, they might start thinking about playing, like, Heimerdinger or Karma, both at 5. But the pressure is not alleviated here. It's really hard for him to do much here. Take a second Elixir of Iron, probably. I think there's a chance this leaves us a bit too vulnerable to a Static Shock. But at the same time, his Static Shock is still not hitting super good value, and the most important thing is, you know, in this case, he doesn't have Static Shock, otherwise he would have used it for the Zed clone. But yeah, the Static Shock is hitting a bit of value regardless. There's not really a ton you can do to play around it here, and of course the odds of him having Static Shock are only about 60-65% right now. Okay, Thermo for 4. That is going to clean up the Zed. But of course, as you can see, I mean, the opponent's just at 6 health here. This deck is very, very, very powerful. It's going to do a great job at kind of like blowing out opponents in like early positions here. Here's a double buffed Lifeblade from Omen Hawk. Lifeblade is another one of these like power cards that you kind of can't really run in the Demacia version anymore. Or at least most Demacia versions have a harder time running Lifeblade. But in this version, you absolutely can, and you absolutely do. Let's go ahead and get this Lifeblade online. His Heimer's not doing too much here. And usually this is where the opponent is going to like go into just a fold or something like that. Because there's not a ton they can do here. Green Glade Duo is a 4-3. You know, we do actually have like a pretty good attack. I'm not really afraid of his like slow speed development here. So I will play the Duo as a 2 mana 4-3. And this leaves enough mana for like Will, Twin Disciplines. He has nothing to really scare me out here with. Like, worst case scenario, he plays like a 3-1 Elusive, which doesn't represent like, you know, an amazing trade here. It's just going to be something that slows this board down. And because we have the double combat trick in hand, that's fine. Okay, so the attack order in this case doesn't really matter. The one reason attack order would matter is if you're thinking the opponent might have Spirit's Refuge, but we have like Will of Ionia anyway for when he goes in with the Spirit's Refuge, so it really shouldn't make a difference. So that is fairly often a Spirit's Refuge to try to stay alive. Of course, he's at -2. And then on top of that, we also have Twin Disciplines to push the 3. So it looks like a pretty clean game here. We're going to go ahead and see what he has. There's a Will. Will is going to, you know, keep him alive somewhat here. I guess it's a fine time to go into our Twin Disciplines. Threaten in this case, like a lethal push. A few things he could have in this position: second Will, second Get Excited, but usually that's pretty rare. And even if he survives one more turn, he doesn't really have a lot of resources, so he can't really do anything about it next turn. So that's a pretty clean first game. I mean, it's very, very just cookie cutter. You know, that's how the deck plays. There's not, honestly, I want, like, I like doing these guides, and I like talking about, like, some of the strategies that decks can use. This is one of the more basic decks. This is, as I mentioned before, this is a deck I would happily recommend when people ask, like, what they should climb with. This is one of the decks I mentioned, because as I said before, it has one of the highest win rates in Masters. It ends games quickly, which is good for climbing, and it's also really, really simple. If anything, probably more simple than, like, you know, a lot of the Shadow Isles decks even that are, I guess, a bit more popular. Okay, so we hit Young Sugo, which is my boy Gummy here, and he's going to be playing Ezreal. Ezreal is a powerful deck, and they tend to have pretty good answers to this deck, so this is a bit of a counter matchup. We're going to have to see how I do. So Hatchling and Protector are a little too slow for this hand, but of course Omenhawk, Conspirator are very good here. Again, that's a super, super basic mulligan, nothing fancy going on in this case. Like, we've got two combo cards, they're both light on curve, they follow into each other. We're going to keep both of them. Send away the later ones. So 2 mana, usually this is like an Iceveil Archer. Again, it's going to be about a 60% chance he has an Iceveil Archer here, depending on how aggressively he mulligans. A little bit under, like 55 or so. And I'm willing to take that risk. At the end of the day, like, if we're really worried about Iceveil Archer, we could develop the other Omenhawk here. Yep, that's going to be fine. Conspirator will pretty often just trade for a Mystic Shot. If we don't have an Elixir of Iron in hand, we can't really play around with that. Now, to note, if I did have Elixir of Iron, I would probably have played the other Omenhawk there instead of anything else. Just because, and this is really important, you want to be able to trade off your iron for the Mystic Shot, right? The one problem is Twin Disciplines, although it represents a similar thing, is not quite the same amount of value, and you're often going to need to use these for the attack in this matchup. So, because we can't really, like, deny the Mystic Shot its value, there's not really any risk to try to keep the Conspirator in hand. So we've got, like, a single buffed Lifeblade, which is pretty nice at a 3-3. That's going to be able to slow the game down a decent amount. You're thinking about Ezreal and what they could have on turn 4. Well, it's usually going to be something like Chump Wump or like a Bull Elnux. So you need like an aggressive flyer. In this case, I think the Lifeblade is just going to do fine. There's no, like, Shadow Assassin doesn't keep up anything on the mana curve. We're down to 2 mana, which doesn't allow anything unique. And even though we don't need Lifesteal, the 3-3 is just more of a pressure tool than Shadow Assassin. The most important thing in this matchup is going to be trying to bait out his Harsh Winds so that we can Battle Fury afterwards, right? This card, especially since it's in our hand already, is going to be effectively our win condition here, right? Pretty easy double jam. No Static Shock, which is pretty good for me. Static Shock gets, you know, definitely enough value there. And he's burning the 2 mana as well, which is also, I would say, good overall. Here's a casual double buffed Zed as he pulls the double Elnuk into 3 troops. That's pretty interesting. I'm pretty happy in this case to use Jeweled Protector on Zed. That's a deck that doesn't really have amazing hard removal. So here's the double buffed Protector for the Omenhawks. You remember what I was saying about the fact that when you have 2 Omenhawks, you do just kind of like win the game. You're very much ahead. Well, this is exactly what's happening here. Like, we had 2 Omenhawks, so now we have a super casual 8-7 Zed in our hand, right? That's pretty bonkers, right? That's pretty crazy. Okay, so the Zed here will leave the Twin Disciplines open, which is kind of nice. He's at 9, which means there's actually a chance he'll move in with a 9 damage Thermo here, and our Twin Disciplines will keep our Zed up. Just important to keep in mind, if we weren't able to keep our Zed up against the Thermo Beam, I probably would have played Shadow Assassin first just to bait him to play some mana. But in this case, the Zed is just a totally fine play here. But yeah, this is a very, very spooky card in this case. His Elnux are definitely going to slow the game down a bit. And, you know, obviously, he can do like Harsh Winds and block to deal Zed some damage as well if he wants. He preempts the Harsh Winds here, which I think makes a lot of sense. Like, that's going to work out pretty fine. There's actually a consideration to go with the Twin Disciplines before the attack, just so Zed's clone gets the buffs as well. Honestly, that might be somewhat necessary here. I mean, being able to have the attackers that at least like threaten the Elnux is quite nice. And it is kind of maximum value you get out of Twin Disciplines, because in any normal situation, Twin Disciplines, unlike Battle Fury, it's kind of hard to get the Disciplines after they Harsh Winds, you know? So an opportunity to use it in a turn where he doesn't have Harsh Winds is pretty nice, and preempting it on the Zed, like, before, you know, in a turn where the opponent has already used their card, being able to get the double value off of buffing the Zed is quite nice. Whereas in a normal situation, like, check this out. Now, if I wanted to buff the Zed, the second buff doesn't really do anything, right? If you think about it like that. Like, preemptively buffing Zed before the attack is a cute thing in concept, but the problem with it is that it ends up kind of not really making sense. The reason for that is because they're always going to block either the Zed or the clone anyway, and they're just going to chump block it with something. So its 8 attack stat line is impressive, but doesn't end up mattering, right? There's the problem. The problem is that when you preemptively buff Zed, you're usually just losing a lot of value in that way. So he's going to go in with a Static Shock here. I'm pretty happy with this. I could use a Shadow Shift to, like, you know, save the duo. There's some weird plays there. In this case, I'm just going to let this through. We don't need a super wide board since we're attacking with our Zed anyway. And I want to just play the Shadow Assassin and bank maximum mana for the Battle Fury. Like, maybe we'll draw, like, you know, Elixir of Iron or something. I'll want to play, like, Battle Fury plus Twin Disciplines, Battle Fury plus Elixir of Iron. You know, there's a lot of, like, 2-card combos that we could be forced to play. So now we have to think, is it possible we want to play the Blade Scout this turn? And I don't think so. We'll play it next turn. Okay, so at the 11 mana, we've got Battle Fury plus Shadow Shift. Shadow Shift is not a really useful card. You got to be worried about slow speed plays. You always ask yourself, okay, you know, what are the things that are going to punish the open attack versus what are the things that are going to pressure the open attack, right? So what's punishing the open attack? Well, that's going to be anything at fast speed, like Harsh Winds, burst, like faster above speed, Harsh Winds. But the real threat is this card, Icefield Archer. He's only played 1, he's got 2 left, which means if we don't open attack, our Zed is extremely vulnerable to getting bullied out by another Archer. We're going to take the easiest open attack of our lives. So this will threaten lethal in a really powerful way. This is exactly what I was talking about when I was talking about the Battle Fury play. We need to threaten lethal in a way where they have to use Harsh Winds before I use my card. And then my Battle Fury can come in as a pretty guaranteed +8 damage card, which is of course going to be super valuable. He's going to go ahead and... Are we locking this in? Ooh, he locks it in, so that puts him to 8, which means he's got 4 mana left over. Now the Ezreal deck, its most typical forms are not running Flash Freeze. I've messed around with 1 Flash Freeze in my version, so I think I will just go in with a Battle Fury here. You got to think about what in that deck might counter you. Well, Battle Fury is going to make us immune to Brittle Steel. Flash Freeze will punish us. It's going to knock our health range out of the ranges of stuff like Get Excited, no matter what we use it on. Basically, in this case, there's not really any big downsides to Battle Fury. The one thing he could do is Flash Freeze to stall it out, and then in that case, we'd rather be using it on something that is probably elusive. There's not really a punish to using it on Wayfinder here, whereas like the Zed is a lot more killable, so I'll take the Battle Fury on the Kinkou Lifeblade here. It ends up being just a bit safer. But yeah, I'm very familiar with the Ezreal deck. It's probably the deck that I have the most experience on. I'm actually bringing it to a tournament in a couple of days. There's the Brittle Steel, which is not unexpected. Of course, that means we get to re-threaten our lethal with Zed's Shadow Shift, which we're going to do. Sending the Shadow Assassin back to our hand gets a nice little bonus because we get to redeploy it and redraw a card. If he survives this, usually what he'll do now is like a Mystic Shot or potentially Get Excited to kill our Shadow Assassin. And I'm pretty okay with this. Alright. So yeah, this is no problem here. If you wanted to threaten lethal a little more aggressively, you could just go with the Shadow Shift on like the Jeweled Protector instead. That's probably a slightly better play there, just because it might end the game like 1 turn earlier. But honestly, the position he's in, I don't think there's any way he can really come back from that. Alright, that's 2 quick games. I just jumped into 2 random games there. I showed off the deck. It's really straightforward. This is just a fucking, like, a no nonsense. It's like a really just slap ass kind of deck. It's pretty straightforward. You can't really mess it up. It's a great deck to be climbing ladder with. It's probably the premium choice right now, and I'd recommend it to anyone who's looking to get a quick climb to Masters or Diamond or whatever you're going for.